what we're now doing is differentiating that, understanding that the professional athlete is pushing a lot more watts in zone 2 than the complete beginner. Therefore, they're churning through a lot more calories and a lot more carbohydrates. So they actually need more carbohydrate than the complete beginner.
G'day and welcome to FuelIn Sessions, the podcast that delves into the science of nutrition. Powered by FuelIn, the AI nutrition app that makes nutrition simple, personalised and adaptive for anyone who exercises and wants to improve their health and performance. We're going to share expert insights, training tips, strategies and hopefully some laughs, maybe not today, so that you can fuel your best and reach your full potential. I'm your host, Scott Tindal, and today I am joined by Dr. Alan McCubbin. Al, how are you, mate?
Yeah, I'm pretty good, thanks, Scott. It's spring as well and truly sprung here. I can hear the birds in the background at your place, so it's getting towards summer, which is nice for us, but not so nice for all our Northern Hemisphere listeners.
No, exactly. Hopefully the birds don't make too much noise, but it probably gives a reflection of where I live in Australia, close to the bush, at least the bush next to Sydney. Mate, that wasn't a slant at you that you're not funny either, by the way.
That's right.
You are an extremely funny guy, but I guess the topic today is not that funny that we're going to dive into some updates for FuelIn and what we've been working on and what we've been promising athletes for the last 12 months. And happy to say that it's all actually here now. And what we are talking about specifically is what we refer to as algorithm V2. And excited is probably an understatement. I think it's super important for this product. I think in March this year, we released FuelIn 2.0. And to be honest, it felt like the launch of FuelIn in its infancy or officially, because up until then, really FuelIn had been about like research and development, product market fit, and developing what we knew would be the premier sort of personalized nutrition app, certainly around the world. And then the launch of FuelIn 2.0 resulted in, and it's been, better than we could have dreamed. Thousands of athletes joining and continuing to join and putting us on the path we're at now. Now, across that 12 months, you have been instrumental in assisting with developing this new algorithm V2. Channing, who's one of our developers and heads up sort of the AI division of it, has been working away. And as I said, 12 months developing, refining, testing Algo V2. And we can say that effectively FuelIn 2.0 now has an engine which has been upgraded to 2.0 as well. And that is super exciting. The big rocks we're going to cover today, just to really, set the scene for the athletes out there and understand what we are covering. FuelIn users will be able to input their thresholds. And I know this is something that athletes have been asking for a long time. So swim, bike, run, you'll now be able to put in your critical swim speed, your bike functional threshold power, and your run threshold power. You can input a known RMR, resting metabolic rate, if you've had it done in a laboratory and you want that hyper-personalized to you. We can now input physical activity, which is the activity level outside of training and exercise, to account for those individuals who have more manual jobs and do a lot more activity. And then more sports are going to be accounted for. So more diverse group of athletes can now use FuelIn. They're the big rocks. Al, what else are we highlighting on today's show?
Yeah, a bunch of things, Scott. And as you said, really exciting, something that we've been working away on since, I reckon, our first discussions around this were probably December 2023, to be honest. So it's almost 2 years now that we've been sort of chipping away at this. And obviously there are times where we pause it to work on other things like the new app development at the start of this year. But yeah, I guess the whole, rationale behind this sort of second algorithm for FuelIn was really around improving the accuracy and the precision across all the different fueling plans with the athletes that we have. And I think one of the things that people don't appreciate necessarily when you use FuelIn by yourself, or maybe a couple of other people that use it as well, is the sheer diversity of the users that we have. And so to come up with an algorithm that fits the needs of all of those different athletes, we've got younger athletes, we've got older athletes, we've got really short, really tall athletes, we've got athletes that are training 2 hours a week versus 32 hours a week. You got professionals and Olympic athletes versus complete beginners. And so to really have something that works across that entire spectrum is incredibly difficult to do. And as you said before, then also looking at branching out, because when you started FuelIn, Scott, it was very much geared around the long course triathlete. That was kind of the main user group that the first algorithm was built around. And so now it's starting to say, okay, well, there's all these other sports expressing interest in using FuelIn, but does the original algorithm suit their needs as well? So it's trying to bring in an algorithm that I think is a little bit more flexible to the needs of other sports, and allows us to build on that into the future, but at the same time also builds to the huge diversity that we have even within the endurance sport community in terms of different types and shapes and sizes and abilities of athletes. So I guess that's probably the main kind of rationale behind it. And it's not a complete replacement of the algorithm. It's more of an upgrade. The core system remains. For a lot of people, they're not going to notice a huge difference sort of day to day. But it is certainly been refined to perform across that diversity. And I guess there's a couple of things that have driven that. One is, as the user base has expanded, we've had a better understanding of what those users are, but we're also seeing how they're interacting with the app, and that gives us a lot of insight into those sort of practical aspects, because we can look at all the science and the nutrition and the fueling and the data and the numbers, but at the end of the day, food isn't just about numbers. It's a behavior. It's something that's, there's cultural aspects, there's social aspects, there's psychological aspects. So we can't just sort of put numbers in one end, pull out numbers at the other end, and not consider any of those other things as well. So there's a lot of, I guess, how the users interact with the app and how they prefer to do things that we've been able to learn from and incorporate in. But of course, the science of sports nutrition is always evolving as well. And so we incorporate that where we can in addition. So it's, I guess, bring those two things together. And I guess the final thing is that we were aware that there were some athletes with the original algorithm, probably at the extreme ends, very big, very small athletes, your complete professionals, those only doing a couple of hours a week of training, something like that. And those doing highly active jobs outside of training. Labor, bricklayers, carpenters, tradespeople of different types, maybe people in the military or other sort of very physically active occupations on top of their training, that we weren't really possibly meeting their needs as well as we could. And so it's trying to meet their needs better without changing things for the people in the middle that it was suited to really well in the first place.
Yeah, and all these points we're going to get into a lot more detail around that. And I think it's, you hit the nail on the head there, that when I initially built this out, it was definitely, laser focused on triathletes. And that was good. It's 3 sports in one, obviously makes it difficult. And my thinking was, if we can tackle that, then we can probably tackle any sport. The reality is that as you start to see the user behavior, as you highlighted, you start to see some of the shortcomings. And I think what's really important here is that the athletes who either use FuelIn now or are thinking about using FuelIn is understanding that it's not a replacement of what we have, it's an upgrade to that system. So there's a lot of things not changing. App layout, functionality, features, they're all going to remain. So if you are a current user, don't freak out. We're not changing it suddenly. What we've got, what we released in March, we're very comfortable with. And as I said, thousands of athletes love that. What is going to be probably a little bit different is there may be some changes in some of the calorie prescriptions, some of the recommendations, the way in which we do that. And that's based on what we now know, based on athlete behavior, but also some changes in the research, what we've seen. And that's exactly what we'll get into more in more detail. If you had to highlight what are the key benefits, in your opinion, of the change for existing users, those who are already familiar with FuelIn and maybe the way in which the algorithm is? What are we seeing as a result of this upgrade to the algorithm?
Mm. Yeah, I think probably three main things that come to mind. I think the first one is better personalization of the recommendations, both within training sessions and outside of training sessions. And what I mean by that is, you mentioned before, incorporating in people's own sort of threshold paces and power outputs and things like that. This has implications both for the within fueling recommendations and the out of fueling recommendations. Within fueling, current sports nutrition guidelines don't take this into account. They sort of talk about, is it higher intensity or lower intensity and the duration of exercise. But when we talk about high and low intensity there, and I know we've talked about this on previous podcasts, we're talking about relative intensity. So it's relative to maybe FTP on the bike, or relative to max heart rate, or relative to VO2 max, if you've been able to measure that or estimate it from a watch or something. And so that's fine. That's important. But what's also important is what we call the absolute exercise intensity. And probably the best example I can give of this is if you can imagine two cyclists riding along, and one's a professional cyclist and they have an FTP of, maybe it's a male, high 300s or even to, the 400 watt mark. And then you have a complete beginner cyclist riding along and their FTP is maybe 180 watts or something like that. So you've got two cyclists riding along and they're both doing, say, like a zone 2 session. Okay. Well, what does that equate to in terms of power? So for a zone 2 power for someone who's got an FTP of 180 watts, that's going to be in the low 100 mark. Whereas someone who's got an FTP of 400 watts, it's going to be in the probably high 200 watt kind of range. I haven't done the numbers off the top of my head. But you think about like how many calories people are expending riding at 200 watts versus, maybe 120 watts or something. Literally double or more the calorie expenditure, double or more the carbohydrate need potentially as well, even though they're both quote unquote zone 2 rides. So having this ability to bring in absolute exercise intensity as well as relative intensity makes a huge difference in terms of the fueling recommendations that we can give, but also how many calories the person needs across the entire week, not just that training session as well. So yeah, I think that first part is the personalization to the athlete's own ability across swim, bike, and run.
And we're going to touch on this a bit more and explain the way in which we're doing this versus, say, for instance, like the Training Peaks Fueling Insights. And what Al mentioned there was power output as opposed to body weight playing a key role, especially on the bike, because, in Al's example, that person with the 400 FTP might be 60 kilos, and the person with the 180 what FTP might be 100 kilos, but it's not the body weight that's important there. It's actually their power output, which is going to determine sort of their energy requirements. And that's probably one of the biggest distinctions. And I think one of the most significant upgrades to the system that we're going to be making, and really providing that precision to, triathletes who are obviously riding, but cyclists, and then anyone who actually uses the bike for training to improve their health or performance. It actually becomes laser focused on what is their power output and what is their energy requirement.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And as I said before, this doesn't even appear in official sports nutrition guidelines. I think it will get there eventually, but those guidelines don't even have that level of detail. So we've had to come up with that ourselves, essentially.
Hence the delay and hence the time required to get this done.
Exactly.
Second biggest benefit?
Yeah, smoother adjustments in calories and macronutrients from day to day and week to week. So currently some users may notice that the way that the macros, particularly the carbohydrate and the calories, are prescribed is kind of based on the weekly training volume, based on the number of hours. And so once you get to a certain number of hours, you kind of tick over a threshold and you might see a big jump, or if you go below that, a big drop in calories. So it kind of goes, I would describe it in steps, up and down. Whereas the way we've sort of redesigned the algorithm makes it more like a ramp than a set of stairs. So the adjustments are much smoother up and smoother down as things change. That means you may actually get a little bit more adjustment week to week, but it'll be more subtle adjustments rather than bigger increases or reductions as training changes from one week to the next.
Yep. And I like that one. I think, again, it's going to make it easier for athletes to understand their calorie prescription requirements and what we're giving them, as opposed to, "Ooh, why did it suddenly jump so much?" And yeah, that's been a learning, certainly on my end, and the way in which I initially described it when we developed it. And I think certainly the smoother approach, I think, is one that will be well received. And number three.
Yeah, so number three deals with the what we call the periodization of the carbohydrate. So existing FuelIn users will know that the protein and fat stays relatively stable from day to day. It's the carbohydrate that adjusts based on the training, and that's that fueling for the work required principle. Basically, we've made some tweaks to how that periodization is done, which part of it is based on sort of scientific research around what kind of optimal periodization looks like, but part of it is also based on the practical aspects of this, and what is reasonable for athletes to do, and what is more practical, particularly for people who are training sort of first thing in the morning. We know a lot of age group endurance athletes are training often at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, so having a massive meal before training is not always that practical. So there's a few adjustments around that. Probably for people who have, I guess, what I would call more peaky training, so a big training session here and then an easy day or a rest day and things, you may see a little bit more, for a lack of a better word, aggressive periodization. And again, that's around really making sure that those key training sessions in the week are fueled as well as they need to be. But potentially pulling that back a little bit at other times of the week where it doesn't need to be, so you're not just adding more calories overall. And then there's a few kind of smaller tweaks, not so much on the carbohydrate, but on the fat and protein. And these, again, are more around the practical side of things. So making sure we're not inadvertently loading up with protein or fat before a big run session or something like that. So a few sort of practical tweaks there just to improve some of that protein and fat prescription around training as well.
Yeah, and again, we will explain some of those in finer detail as the episode goes on. The other update, I think, which relates to algorithm update or 2.0 Algo, is we've had some significant changes with the way in which we're allowing users or prescribing users meals for food logging. And we've released this feature called Smart Meals, which, to be honest, it's what athletes have been asking for a long time. It's like, well, can't you just tell me what you want me to eat based on what my preferences are? And that's exactly what Smart Meals is. So now the user can hit the meal or the snack that we're prescribing to them with their carb color, their protein, their fats prescribed. They can hit Smart Meals, tap on that, and either select coach recommendations, which will provide 3 options specific to those macros and that meal, the meal timing and the meal amounts, or they can hit meals with and then simply just tell FuelIn what ingredients, what they've got in their fridge, or they can hit eating out and just tell them which restaurant they're eating out at. And the feedback for this has been pretty unreal, I must say. And we did bank on it being a feature that athletes would love, and it's worked out really well so far. So the athletes that are using it, they're starting to go, oh my God, this is exactly what I wanted. It really is now reducing or removing that guesswork, taking away that sort of decision paralysis, and just literally giving the athlete 3 meal options that fit their exact macros precisely at that point in time. And where this is going to go with, now with this algorithm update, a better precision around what those actual macronutrients and total calories are for those meals and snacks, and then layering on top of that the Smart Meals feature, it's really now going so much beyond just a food tracker, which we've never been a food tracker. Food tracking is part of FuelIn. But now you have that specificity of macronutrients, calories to the meal, specific to the timing of your training and what your goals are. And that's, for me, is the biggest distinction between what FuelIn is and what every other macro tracker is we take into account your training, your exercise, your goals, and how that applies to your nutrition. And I think it's pretty unreal, to be honest. Like, I think this feature it's just blowing people away, which is really cool. And it's just the start of it. It's at the moment, it's meal and snacks specific. Where it will be the entire week's meals. You'll then have the entire week's planned out for you based on your personal preferences. And that's, I think it's what athletes have been asking for, and now we're delivering.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's moving from tracking to planning. And I mean, that was always, you always have the ability with any kind of tracking system to, rather than tracking as you're eating, is to use the tracking ahead of time to plan what you're eating. But this is just taking it to a whole new level.
Yeah. And that ability, I think it's only going to make, it's only going to make the outcome better for the athlete. It certainly is. Now, what it's also doing, Al, is eliminating the need for external food trackers like MyFitnessPal, Lose It, which historically, look, and we're still going to continue to have these because I think it is important to give athletes the choice for those who want to use things like MyFitnessPal and Lose It. But what we're seeing is a vast majority of the athletes now just leaving that and actually just using FuelIn directly. You have been involved. You asked us, you work at Monash University, and you said, well, maybe we should get some of your PhD students to start looking at the data and seeing what it is. And do you want to give a little bit of an update on what you had your PhD students do?
Yeah, well, actually, it wasn't a PhD student; it was a nutrition science student, Ocean Wong.
There you
so
go.
shout out to Ocean. But yeah, we spent the last probably 6 months or so doing a little project where we wanted to compare the AI tracking function in FuelIn to existing tracking functions. So both professional nutrition software. So we used Nutritics in particular, and MyFitnessPal. And so what we did is we took a whole bunch of records that had been logged in the past from 111 athletes, I think it was in the end. And then we entered those into Nutritics, and then we entered them in exactly the same way into MyFitnessPal and into the AI tracking using the identical method that's used within the FuelIn app. We did it external just because it was easier, but it was, the results are identical to what you would get within the app. And then we basically compared them to see whether we would get the same results or not. So what we did is we had 3-day food records. So we had 3 consecutive days of food diaries, basically, that we entered into all 3 systems. And then we looked at the average per day for calories, protein, carbohydrate, fat, and actually fiber, because that's an area that we're interested in as well. And just to see what the differences would be between the different systems. So compared to the professional dietary analysis, or compared to MyFitnessPal, actually the results were quite similar. So basically we look at what's called the mean absolute difference, which is basically if you enter the same identical food record into 2 systems, how different are they in either direction? One is higher, one is lower, but it doesn't necessarily say which one's which. And so for total calories between the AI food tracking that's within the app and MyFitnessPal, the difference was about 200 calories a day in either direction on average, which some people might say that sounds like a lot, but it's actually within 10% of the total calories that have been logged, the total calories from that food record. And it's well within the margin of error for actually just human error entering that data in the first place and estimating portion sizes and all that kind of stuff. Protein, the difference in either direction was on average 16 grams a day, fat 12 grams a day, carbohydrate 28, and fiber 5. So I guess that gives you a bit of an idea of how similar I guess they are. And then compared to the professional nutrition software, the results were not identical to that, but very, very similar.
Yeah. And I think what's really cool here is when I look at these results, obviously a lot of people take MyFitnessPal as gospel. They think of it as being like this, if it's not the same as MyFitnessPal, then it can't be right. But what we demonstrated with this, and as it's preliminary, is that actually Scooter, like our AI food tracker, is definitely within the region or within the realms of what is deemed very acceptable to a verified database, food database. And so the biggest advantage I see from that is that we only provide one choice, and it actually selects that choice for you when you talk to FuelIn and you say chicken breast, 250 grams. It selects that 250 grams, and it removes that need for you to scroll through 3,000 types of chicken breast at 250 grams that MyFitnessPal gives you. So what we're doing is the reliability is, very similar, but the reduction or the removal of that sort of, oh, what do I choose now? It's done for you. And I think for so many users, they're like, oh, it's just so much easier. Just be specific with the amount, the type of ingredient you're eating, and even the name of it, and we'll do the heavy lifting for you. It doesn't require you to sort of, search through whatever it is you said. And I think for me, that's probably one of the biggest advantages of, the food tracking system we have built in FuelIn, but also what Smart Meals is then able to provide as well.
And I think one of the caveats there is just, you said, 250 grams of chicken breast. Having the portion size when you enter it into Scooter is super important.
Yep.
Because if you don't tell it what portion size, if you just say, I ate chicken, rice, and mixed vegetables or something, and you don't tell it the portion size, it's going to have to guess what those portion sizes were. And we do have some safeguards built into the AI function that will kind of try and provide roughly kind of standardized portion sizes if you leave those out completely, but it still may not be anything like what you actually ate. So just like MyFitnessPal, I guess the difference there is you have to enter manually the actual portion size and it won't spit you out an answer if you don't. The AI will still spit you out an answer, but it's going to have to guess the portion size if you don't tell it. So just I guess a reminder for people that when you are tracking with the AI is remember to include your portion sizes if you want it to be accurate.
Yeah, I think we default to the closest 100 grams, which is, you usually see on the nutrition information panel on the back of products. So, it's a good lesson. And most people do it once or twice. Then they sort of might be like, oh, it's not accurate. And then you sort of point it out and they're like, oh, sorry, my fault.
Yeah.
And then they get it right. So,
yeah,
so that's cool.
And so I was just going to mention the other little quirk of AI that we wanted to test with this project is obviously if you feed something into like a MyFitnessPal or a professional database and you look up the same literal item in the list of options, you're going to get the same result every single time. But of course, AI is going off and doing that in the background and you don't necessarily know, or it's not visible to the end user what's going on in the background. So the other thing we wanted to test is if you put the identical food record into AI a few days apart, are you going to get the same result back consistently every time? And the answer was it wasn't exactly the same every time, but it was within 5% for calories and all the macronutrients. So it wasn't perfect. And I think that's probably a limitation of AI that we all sort of know and recognize. But it was pretty close. It was close enough to be good enough for the purposes of tracking.
And I know with that information, like we can take that then to the developers and then we can add further prompts and improve the script to actually ensure that reliability for those repeat recalls actually gets lower and lower, and to the point where it should be zero. It should be 0% difference.
Correct.
And I have no doubt that we'll be able to get to that. It's just then it's using the athlete data and then refeeding it back in until we get to that point where it's like, no, this is the true result. Now just stick to it. And we just keep teaching it that as we go. But as you say, even preliminary, like less than 5% difference, it's good. It's not exactly where we want to be, but it's certainly heading in the right direction. So I think some other things that athletes will see just in terms of basic sort of shake up is the settings section. And this does relate to Algo V2 in that you will be able to hyper personalize your nutrition preferences, which will relate to Smart Meals. So things like obviously your dietary preference, but then food choice preference. So this is things like your allergies or intolerances, your dislikes, your exclusions. So if you don't like tomatoes, you can put that, and none of the meals will ever recommend tomatoes to you. Or you dislike apples. Okay, fine. We can do that. And then in terms of meal and snack preferences, specific to breakfast, lunch, dinner, and your snacks, you can now pick the cuisines that you prefer for those particular meals and snacks. You can pick the foods that you would prefer to eat, or the types of foods, so the types of proteins, the types of grains, the types of vegetables, and that will become hyper-personalized with smart meal recommendations, which again is going to be, I think, very, very significant for athletes just to have that sort of wow factor. That settings will also obviously have things like your FTP that we mentioned, RMR, your persona, your physical activity level outside of training, and so on. So yes, there will be more detail to input if you want to personalize. Otherwise, based on your persona, which we will touch on in a minute, we will then default and provide all those default values, which is pretty cool. So, Al, if we want to dive into the details we touched on just before, maybe some of the differences that athletes are going to see and the personalization. If we, this better personalization of in-session fueling recommendations, what does it look like for athletes? What does it look like, and how have we done it is probably the best place to start. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Well, I probably let the cat out of the bag earlier, didn't I, with the absolute versus relative intensity? But I guess that's the key to it all, isn't it? So maybe before we get into that, I wonder whether it's worth describing personas now, because that's relevant to this discussion. Do you want to talk about what personas are?
Yeah, so what we're going to introduce into FuelIn is that you will have a choice of 4 personas. The first one will be recreational. So as it describes, you're a recreational, you're probably new to exercise, you're not that serious, you're just getting into it. We then have trained, which is someone who follows a training program, pretty legitimate about their training, and understands sort of following a progressive sort of training program. We then have competitive, and competitive is that individual who finishes probably pretty high up in their age group. They're consistently sort of hitting podiums and top sort of rankings within their age group brackets or whatever sport they're in. And then we have the elite professional persona, and it's pretty much as the name says. And that will be for those individuals who really sit there. And the importance of this is, as I said, if you don't know certain metrics, these personas are built around research-supported descriptions of athletes. So that's the first important point. We didn't just make these up. And then what that will provide, say, for instance, you're in the recreational or you're in the trained or even in the competitive group, and you don't know maybe what your critical swim speed is or your bike FTP or your run threshold pace, we can provide those default values for you based on normative data that exists in the research. And so that then plays into, I think, what you're going to describe, Alan, which you already did describe in terms of like this relative versus absolute power difference. And do you want to, like, we're doing it, I touched on this, we're doing it differently from Training Peaks, their fueling insights calculation. And I just want to really give a quick overview of how we're doing it and why we're doing it this way.
Yeah, so there's a few different ways you could do this, and Training Peaks basically takes your data from a training session, so it does it retrospectively, not prospectively. So it's not suggesting what it expects the carbohydrate use to be. It's saying after the fact what it thinks it was. So what it does is it takes your session data, compares it against a bunch of lab-generated data, and then has to make some extrapolations based on body weight and competitive level of the athlete to sort of estimate where you fit compared to that sort of lab-based data. What we've done...
Just on that, Al, my understanding on that is exactly what you said. It's based on body weight. It's based on their persona that they pick in, and then based on this lab data. Yep. As far as I'm aware, it's not taking into account FTP.
I'm not 100% sure, but yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that, yeah. So, or it's
But
not
it's
taking into
using the
account
metrics
the
from the
power output.
session.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So what we've done is a little bit different. I guess one of the challenges that we have with FuelIn is we're not. I mean, it's interesting to look at what that data is after you've done the session and you've logged your data and you've uploaded your file from your Garmin or your Wahoo or whatever it is, your power meter, and that's all fine. But we need to predict before the session even starts what we think it's going to be, because that's important in terms of suggesting how much carbohydrate you should be taking during the session. And so we've used instead more of a first principles approach, looking at the relationship between power if it's on the bike, or pace if it's running or swimming, and energy expenditure based on previous research that sort of looked at that. And so it's really trying to predict ahead of time based on the type of session that's been described. Is it a run of zone whatever, zone 2, zone 3, and trying to estimate the calorie expenditure based on those parameters and the duration of the session. And then also looking at that around sort of carbohydrate needs for that type of session based on that combination of the relative intensity, which we use the zones for that, the absolute intensity, which is then taking the power or threshold pace, depending on whether it's swim, bike or run, and then the duration of the session, putting those together to describe what we think that the carbohydrate needs will be for that session, and then using that to kind of take the existing carbohydrate guidelines during exercise, but adjust them up and down according to those parameters for each individual athlete. And so what you'll probably start to see now is a lot more. They're not going to be big changes, but subtle changes up and down and adjustments from session to session in the amount of carbohydrate that's being recommended. After a few weeks of training, you'll probably see patterns emerge just like you do with the existing algorithm, because it's based on your sort of thresholds and things. But it might mean that what's being recommended to you is being slightly different to what's recommended to the next person, because your thresholds are slightly different to theirs. So as you said, Scott, if you've got those sort of threshold paces for swim and run, you can enter those into the app and it will personalize it to that. And if you don't, it'll take that persona that you've nominated and take the default values, kind of the average for that persona, and apply that instead, unless you override it with your own personalized values.
Yeah. So effectively, depending on where you sit with your power output, whether that be swim, bike, run, you would then be positioned, I guess, in do we call it a bucket, where we, based on what that power output is, we can predict what the requirements would be based on carbohydrate oxidation and glycogen stores as predicted based on body weight, height, gender, and then be able to put them into these buckets based on then the duration of the session and the relative intensity that we expect the athlete to be pushing at. And I think it's so unique, and the level of detail required to do that, it's, yes, the user will probably see just similar recommendations, as in it's the same format, but the detail at which your recommendations could differ from your friend based on what your ability is could be significantly different.
Yeah,
Which is
absolutely.
cool,
And I
isn't
guess
it?
it's, yeah, yeah. And I guess probably the best analogy I could use, or best example I can use of that, would be, again, a professional athlete goes out for a 2-hour zone 2 ride, and a complete beginner goes out for a 2-hour zone 2 ride. Now, according to nutrition guidelines, the amount of carbohydrate recommended for them would be the same. And pretty much any other system in the world would recommend the same. What we're now doing is differentiating that, understanding that the professional athlete is pushing a lot more watts in zone 2 than the complete beginner. Therefore, they're churning through a lot more calories and a lot more carbohydrate. So they actually need more carbohydrate than the complete beginner.
Yeah, and well, I mean, that's exactly how FuelIn 1.0 Algo works. It's zone 2, so we predict, again, based on what we knew, okay, 30 to 50 grams of carbs is what we, zone 2, that's probably what is based on, your requirements. But if you're an extremely, powerful athlete, that 50 grams an hour, even in zone 2, may be way under fueling. And I think we've seen this with the professionals that we work with. It's like, we actually have to manually adjust their zone 2 sessions to actually meet their nutritional guidelines or their requirements. And so rather than having to manually adjust this, it actually will just do it for us. And
Completely.
that's amazing.
Yeah, and I think that's where the original discussion about, the V2 algo even came from in the first place, was the suspicion that we were potentially slightly underfueling the professional athletes and possibly overfueling the complete beginners. And because all sports nutrition guidelines essentially do that anyway, it's not like that's unique to FuelIn. So yeah, it's exciting to be able to structure those sort of differences. And I guess what I'd say here too, and you mentioned the kind of the bucket concept, Scott, is that it's not like, if you enter an FTP of 220 watts and then you change it to 225, you're not going to see this big jump in terms of the carbs that's prescribed. I mean, if you went from 220 watts to 320 watts, yes. But little minute changes like that of, 5, 10, even up to 20 watts in your FTP is probably not going to change the recommendation. And bearing in mind that the recommendations are a range, it's not like 42 grams an hour. It's, 40 to 60 or whatever the recommendation is. So there is a range there, because some of that's based around the practicality of the products you take with you and how thirsty you are on the day and all that kind of stuff. But also it's because even with this level of specificity, we can't say exactly what that number should be. And in fact, there are no official guidelines that would actually reach into the physiology of athletes and say it should be exactly this number.
Yeah, and it's a really good point now, because obviously with all this now testing that's going on, you hear, stuff around, like we covered the exogenous glucose oxidation, and, people are now going to be thinking, oh, I only oxidize 63 grams per hour. That's all and it's like, come on, there's still going to be a range there. And I think much like we do now in the text, we provide a range. So, let's call it 40 to 60 grams an hour. We will provide an average as a target for the athlete to hit. But for that athlete to keep in mind, a bit like pushing watts, you can never just stay at 220 watts. It's probably going to fluctuate based on how you're feeling. You might hit 40 grams an hour one day, it might be 60 grams an hour the other day. Yes, the midpoint is 50 grams an hour. Net doesn't make too much difference. As long as you're in that zone and you consume somewhere between 40 and 60 grams an hour, you log that. We take that into account for what was required in that in session. But the bigger picture is that's also taken into account for the day's nutrition. And we're accounting for that energy intake and energy output in that session and how that's going to impact the rest of the day and the rest of the week.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which is pretty cool. So I think probably the really simple takeaway from this is that smaller, powerful athletes are better fueled. Heavier, weaker athletes are better fueled. And that's probably the easiest way of thinking about this, if we really want to dumb it down.
Absolutely.
Talked about the smooth prescription of calories. Probably don't need to go on too much more about this. I think for me personally, yes, this was something that I recognized needed to be addressed based on athlete feedback. Discussed it with you, discussed it with Megan. How can we do it better? Okay, yes, we can smooth out that rather than having those steps. And I think it will reduce some of that confusion as to, why do I suddenly have this many calories this week versus this week, where I've only increased maybe my training load from 1 hour, from 9.5 hours to 10.5 hours, and we saw this big jump. So I think that's, it's a very simple change that we've made, but I think it will result in significant improvement to athlete satisfaction. Can you explain this one? The activity level outside of training or physical activity level, PAL. How have we implemented that and why?
Obviously, there's probably to some degree a standard, if you like, level of activity that people have outside of their training. But there are always going to be outliers in that. You have and maybe it is a stereotype to how much extent it actually happens. Maybe you ask Jan or Daniela, but the professional athlete who just lies on the couch every hour of the day that they're not actually doing their training session to kind of rest and recover. So they're very sedentary outside of training. Then you've got probably the majority of the population who are working maybe a desk job. They're up and about a little bit. Maybe they have to walk to the bus stop or the train station or whatever it is. But they're not hugely active outside of training. And then you've got the people who, as we said before, are tradespeople. They're crawling around inside roofs. They're up and down ladders. They're carrying bricks. They're in the military or the police force or the fire brigade or something like that. And so they're actually quite active outside of their training sessions. And so we wanted to introduce a way of being able to account for all of that calorie expenditure as well, to again make sure that we're not underfueling those super active people or potentially overfueling the people who are pretty much couch potatoes outside of their formal exercise sessions. So we introduced this additional part to make adjustments to calories to account for that activity that's happening outside of training as well. And so this will be one of the options you mentioned before, Scott, in the athlete menu, where you put in, currently you adjust your weight and your weight goals and all that kind of stuff. One of the additional things that you'll be able to adjust in there now is how active are you outside of training. So I think off the top of my head, there's maybe 5 different categories or descriptions based on, just everyday descriptions of this. And it'll take, whichever of those you think sort of best reflects your day-to-day activity outside of training, and then make adjustments to your calories based on that. And again, like everything else, if you're listening to this and the system's already live, there will be a default that's put in there which kind of fits the average person within the population. But obviously, if you're a clear outlier from that, you can go in and manually adjust that.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting, and I think this will be one of the areas that we'll keep an eye on within the program, because I know we've had a lot of internal discussions around how active are people, and I think even when I look at the descriptions, they've probably been around for a long time. And I think with COVID, honestly, working from home, I think that activity level, it's just dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped outside of exercise. Like, I can look at my watch some days and I've done 1,500 steps because I literally walked from my bed to the kitchen table to the shower to my desk, and that's it. And I've sat at my desk for 12 hours. And so I think it's going to be one of those ones where maybe by the research, the number is what it's set at. But I think perhaps we may have to ratchet that down depending on what we're seeing with how athletes are actually achieving body composition goals. And I think it will just be one of those ones we'll just, put a little flag on it and keep an eye on it. And the beautiful thing is we can adjust that in the back end, much like, the caloric estimation. That can be adjusted now based on what we see from thousands of data input. And that caloric estimation, that's been improved. So there's been an update to the formula for the RMR. I don't think we'll give away what we've done with that update. Might be giving away a little bit of the secret sauce. But also what's really important is that athletes, and I know like Human Powered Health, a big company in the US, they've specifically requested this, that, if an athlete has a known RMR, can they input it into your system? Yes, you can do that now. And it is something a lot of athletes want to do. We will flag, though, if that RMR is outside of a predicted RMR by 10%. I think you've highlighted this many times, Al, where it's like someone will say, no, I've got an RMR of 2,500 calories. And you're like, I don't think so, big fella. Like, it just doesn't happen. And people will rely on that as to either that's why they require more and more calories or food to fuel them, or it's also their excuse or maybe their reasoning as to why they're not losing body fat or achieving whatever it is their body composition goals are.
Yeah, absolutely. So if someone's RMR is more than 10% below what an equation would predict, that's actually a flag potentially for low energy availability, that something's not right. Now, I've had situations in the past where I've seen athletes that have gone and have a test and that's much more than 10% below, and they've then had a follow-up test and it's completely normal again. And so I suspect what's actually happened is there was just a problem with the test itself, whether the machine wasn't calibrated right at the start, or it wasn't set up properly, or the mask or whatever system they were using to capture that breath was leaking air in and out, so it's mucked up the result. And that happens both on the under and the overestimation side, but actually more common is the overestimation. It's the athlete that's not adequately rested. It's the one that's sitting upright in a chair rather than lying down. It's the one that's had a mask put on them and they're a little bit claustrophobic, and so they that tends to get them a bit agitated, and or the test where they're in and out in 10 minutes and they're not given that time to actually rest properly before the measurements even started.
Yeah, there's no stability. There's no stability in the readings. Yeah.
And so you do tend to see overestimations in that case.
Yeah, and I do the same thing. Whenever anyone says to me, no, this is my predicted RMR, I'm like, go back to the place where you had that done and get it retested. But this time, make sure you have 15 minutes rest before you even get onto the bed. Make sure you're lying down. Make sure the test takes at least 15 minutes, and then tell me what the result is. And then they typically come back a little bit sheepish saying, oh, yeah, it's actually 300 or 400 calories less than what was done the first time. And you're like, okay, now we can start looking at it. So, yeah, I think that's pretty cool. What other updates, mate?
Yeah, so I mentioned before sort of the way that carbohydrate is periodized around training sessions across the week has been updated, and this is partly based on changes in research over time. It's partly based on just how the overall algorithm for calories and things works, and trying to manage that and the balance between the in and out of session fueling as well, which is a bit more integrated than probably the original algorithm was built. But it's also based on practical experience of working with athletes and seeing how athletes use the data and what time of day that athletes train as well. So as I mentioned at the start, a lot of age group athletes are training very early in the morning. And so then getting them to, have this enormous sort of snack or meal before they go out training isn't always that practical when you've got to get up and be training within 20 minutes of getting out of bed kind of thing. So
they see the green meal and they're like, oh shit, how am I going to get that in? I mean, there is a time and a place, and we do position those green meals, high carb, 100 grams or more of carbs before training for specific sessions. But yeah, to your point, I think removing as many of them as we can based around this carb periodization is again a move in the right direction.
Yeah. And if they still need that fuel, some of it will be moved back to the evening before, just as you would the day before a race. Obviously, it's not to the extreme of carb loading, but sometimes that carbs will be moved back to the night before just to make it a little bit more practical for people. And if their training session is, a couple of hours, if they're not training till 7 or 8 in the morning, then they can be given a bit more to eat in the morning because you've got time. But if it's at, 4:30 or 5 in the morning, obviously that's not always so practical. I guess the other thing that
actually, Al, before you do go on, it is actually something that we probably have glossed over is the current system is like, okay, before 7 o'clock, then you get snack one before a session. Like that's how we sort of position it. Now what we're doing is hyper-focusing this, as you said, like if your session is like, I think it's from 4 to, I think it's 5:50, I think it's to 5:30, give or take, then yes, that meal before that, we will actually ratchet down and push to the meal the night before because the practicality of making that is there. Whereas if it's after sort of 6 o'clock in the morning, okay, if required, you will be given that green meal then. Otherwise, you would just be given the meal the night before and so on. And I think, again, it's like the old system wasn't wrong. We would still give you, the carbs as required. But now this is making it even more practical based on specifically when are you training. And so this will impact athletes. If they want that hyper focus, then yes, enter your time of day of your training sessions in the morning. Because if it is 5 in the morning, your fueling will be even more hyper focused than say the default of 7 in the morning. And I think it's definitely a move in the right direction there.
Yep. And probably the other thing just around the periodization that that changes a little bit is, and again, it fits with that sort of research and recommendations around the sort of fueling for the work required, quote unquote, is it'll probably do that a little bit more aggressively if you have, say, a hard session in the afternoon of one day and then another hard session the next morning. You've got to back it up, but there's only, 2 or 3 meals or snacks in between those. It'll be a bit more aggressive of encouraging more carbohydrate intake to refuel from one and prepare for that next session than currently.
Yeah, and again, it's something I didn't originally take into account, and therefore there has been occasions where someone does a hard session, and then they probably don't have quite enough carbs after that session to adequately refuel and prepare for the next session, and so that second session does get compromised. And we've seen this more recently in the research, haven't we? We've seen some of these studies where it's looked at reduced carbohydrate feeding after a high intensity session and then looking at the subsequent day performance. And the subsequent day performance was reduced if the carbohydrates wasn't adequate post that day before session. And so utilizing, current research, again, it's an upgrade to the system. And so it just means athletes will perform better in the sessions where the coach expects them to perform and therefore get the adaptation and then continue to improve.
And the flip side to that is if you've got a hard session today and then there's maybe 2 or 3 days until the next hard session, you've just got a couple of recovery sessions or a rest day or something in between, it's going to spread that carbohydrate out a lot more. So you're not going to be having these massive carb meals when you've got 2 or 3 days recovery time in between harder sessions.
Yeah, and people will, whether there's probably this perception, okay, well, I don't need to eat that big green meal afterwards, so therefore I'm improving my fat oxidation. And they're thinking that, whether that is actually what's happening or not, probably not. Just actually the time spent training is going to have the big impact on that. But as you say, you don't need to be cramming yourself full of potentially, some of those higher glycemic carbohydrates because we know we've got time to replenish you anyway. And so I think there's a lot of advantages, even just from a health perspective, that, we can layer those. You can ensure lots of vegetables, fruits throughout to get your carbohydrates and then layer in some of those extra carbs, but you've got plenty of meals to achieve your goal, which is really cool. What else? Anything else around, anything else around the periodization that sort of requires addressing?
No, I don't think so. I mean, maybe one of the other things that's sort of partly related to that is just some updates to some of the text recommendations. So existing users will know that when you look at a particular meal or a snack, it will give you some advice around, it might be the inclusion of fruit, for example, at mid-meal snacks or vegetables with main meals, but also it gives you some suggestions around the timing of meals before or after training sessions. So that will remain. That hasn't necessarily changed, but there's been a couple of other sort of tips and advice that's been added in there. So things like adjusting fiber intake prior to some of those harder sessions where maybe the risk of gut issues is greater as well.
Yeah, and I think those type of things, whilst they're static text, what we're then building on top of that is then this is where the AI component is going to become more and more relevant to the user. Like the algorithm's there, the output's there, but then what the AI is going to start to do is actually help coach these athletes, especially those athletes on the autopilot program who don't have access to you, to Megan, to me, to actually start to get some of these insights around, hey, you're doing great, you're logging the correct types of foods, or actually, that choice of food there maybe wasn't the best choice. We did recommend you should have reduced fiber. You chose leafy greens. Maybe next time opt for something a little bit different. Here's some examples. And again, that coaching experience will come, and that's how we will leverage AI more and more into the program. Which is really cool. You mentioned the carb loading experience as well, and I think this is it's a good one to finish on probably because what we've seen with athletes is, first of all, I think the whole experience of a proper carb load done correctly for women and men, like it blows athletes' minds. Even the way it's done now in Algo V1, they're like, oh my God, I didn't realize. I always thought, a pizza or a bowl of pasta was a carb load. And now they're like, this is so much fun, actually eating this much carbs, preparing for a race. So I think that's great. Based on the personas, we now adjust the grams per kilogram as well, which is a really cool thing. So if you're a recreational athlete, you'll still get 8 grams per kilo as a minimum threshold. But if you're if you're in those personas of, competitive and professional, well, your actual grams per kilo is going to be much higher. So you're now going to be pushed into sort of, 10, 11, 12 grams per kilo of carbs. And as a result of that, and what we've seen practically, as you touched on, Al, is we're going to just ratchet the protein down. Those days before, let's ratchet the protein down, let's ratchet the fat down to accommodate the extra calories for this increased amount of carbs, to allow the athlete to take in the carbs, which is the important part of the macronutrient you're fueling with. We're still giving you optimal protein, and it's still high protein, relatively speaking, to, say, the RDI or anything like that. It's just not going to be as high as what you would typically be taking in on the FuelIn program. And definitely, anecdotally, I'm doing this more and more manually with my athletes, and the feedback is, yeah, this is awesome. I felt light. I felt great. I wasn't like bogged down. And, just bringing that protein down, bringing the fat down with that carb load, I think is ultimately going to be really well received by athletes and just done in a very systematic way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that when you work with athletes around carb loading, just the amount of carbs, particularly if they're not used to eating that amount on a day-to-day basis. Often for some of the pros, they're eating not necessarily that amount, but close to it because their training volume is so high day-to-day, week-to-week anyway. But for the more sort of recreational athletes, maybe those who are training less than, say, 15 hours a week, you just don't need that much carbs on a day-to-day basis. And so then to ratchet that up so much for carb loading is a big shock to the system. And so a lot of people really just struggle to get the volume of food in that's required to achieve that carb loading effectively. And, two of the easiest quick wins to make that easier and more comfortable experience for people is just to reduce the fat and protein intake, because that's going to slow down stomach emptying. It's going to fill you up without really adding value in terms of that preparation for race day.
Yeah, I think that will be one feature that, or change or upgrade to the Algo, that I think will be really well received, and I think we'll see more and more positive feedback around that. And then I did say that would be where we'd finish, but actually there is one other thing, and I think it's really what we've been hyper focused on is strengthening like those safeguards to prevent underfueling, for health and performance reasons. And again, I'll put my hand up and say, like, I don't believe there is any perfect nutrition system. I think what we've built at FuelIn with 1.0 has been incredible. I think 2.0 is going to be even better. I think at the forefront of my mind, and certainly yours and Megan's, is always health and performance. And I think we do recognize there are cases where that very light athlete who's very powerful, or that very heavy athlete who is very weak, where we have some of these mismatches in fueling. And I think we want to reduce that down and ultimately reduce it to zero, where every athlete is fueled exactly as they should be based on their purpose. But I think this next iteration of the algorithm will provide better safeguards, ensuring that based on RMR, that we're not going below that. We always have a safeguard above that as an absolute minimum. That based on the personas, based on their actual power outputs, that we know more precisely what the fueling requirements will be. And so I think that's going to be, again, really well received, especially based on those athlete type of personas I mentioned, the light, strong, the heavy, weak type person. I think they'll just see an improvement with what they're getting prescribed.
Yep. What it will mean is for people who set a weight loss goal, potentially, is that if they're not doing a huge amount of training and they've set an aggressive weight loss goal, it might curtail the calorie deficit that puts them into. And as you said, that's really a safeguard from a health point of view, and from an overall nutrition adequacy point of view, to make sure they're just eating enough for their general health, even if that compromises the calorie deficit or how quickly they're going to be potentially losing weight. And then for the athletes that are doing large amounts of training, well, maybe more than moderate amount, I think the big volumes won't be necessarily impacted. But yeah, again, just preventing those calories dropping to the rate, or the the depths of how low it is that would be potentially an issue from a health point of view is a really important one. And I know one we've talked about, for at least a couple of years now. So it's great to have that integrated in with this version of the Algo.
Yep. Yep. I think it's, as with all these things, it's never done. It's just a work in progress, as we like to say. And it is happening. It is happening now. These features, this algorithm, it's being tested. We'll just continue to roll it out more and more, a bit like the smart meals feature. We just want to make sure it's right. And then as we get more and more confident with it, it will be rolled out, and it'll be rolled out to the entire FuelIn athlete population. I think it is the future I think the future is now in sports performance nutrition. I think your clinical experience, your educational experience on this has been instrumental. And, I couldn't thank you enough for, I guess it's nearly like mentoring me now in a way, and saying, okay, well, this is what you built, Scott. Can we do it a little bit differently? Can we do it better? Yeah, I think so. And I was certainly open to that because, I think it's having one person building something great, having two, having three, it's just been such a better experience. And yeah, I think it's going to blow a lot of athletes away. I think coaches just going to be like, well, just this is it. This is what you need if you want to actually get the results that you're after. So, and you don't have to be a professional. You don't have to be, super high level to now get those results. It will accommodate for, that recreational athlete who just actually, I think of a lot of my mates, they're probably just wanting to get rid of the dad bod and understand what is their nutrition requirements based on the training or little training that they're doing. And it might give them a real insight into, oh, okay, this is what I need now. I need to get on it. So it's exciting, mate. And as I say, just thank you for all the time and the effort, and thank you for today's session. And I think with that, we'll sign off.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, bud.